there's enough evidence now that programs of structural adjustment initiated by the World Bank and also associated programs, loans given or stabilization loans given by the IMF have been associated with severe reductions in food subsidy in a large number of countries. In fact, in one of the early studies of this impact of structural adjustment and stabilization on the social sectors in a book called Adjustment with a Human Face, Andrea Cornea, Richard Jolly and Francis Stewart, they had pointed out that in large number of case studies which they looked at, 94 countries with structural adjustment, there is an attempt to reduce the food subsidies. Specifically, these programs have come with two types of interventions. One is to reduce food subsidies by shifting from universal schemes to targeted schemes, and the other is shifting from more direct food distribution programs such as a ration distribution or other kinds of programs in different parts of the world to food stamps or food coupons. And I can probably just illustrate with the example of one or two countries of what kind of impact this has had on the people, on malnutrition, on poverty, on food security and hunger in general. Let me take example of two countries, Sri Lanka, which is near us, similar to us in many ways, and Jamaica. Both of these countries have been written about by Amartya Sen and others as cases, as models as it were, of countries that managed to achieve relatively high levels of human development with relatively low or modest incomes. I mean, their per capita incomes, both are developing countries, are not very high. So these two countries, which were actually taken as models for the kind of intervention programs they were having, both of them we see how when after structural adjustment and IMF loans and associated policy changes, including cuts in food subsidy, how it actually went against what happened. Let me tell you about Sri Lanka first. In Sri Lanka, just as in India, there was a universal rationing system. And this was started by the British in 1942, wartime rationing as it was in India. And this system, after independence, unlike India, in Sri Lanka it was quite, it was run very well and it was quite effective in terms of the contribution that the purchase of ration, mainly rice, made to household nutrition. In the early 70s, there was some attempt at sort of mild targeting in Sri Lanka. They tried to separate the benefits to income taxpayers and non-income taxpayers. But the real cuts to the scheme came in the late 70s when the Sri Lankan government, after started negotiating a loan with the IMF. In fact, one of the scholars, Lal Jayawardena, no longer alive today, wrote, but very perceptive commentator on Sri Lanka, wrote that the IMF negotiating team wanted to do away with food subsidies totally. And somehow the Sri Lankan negotiators managed to say that, okay, we'll keep some subsidy at least for the targeted group or so on. And what happened was that just as it happened in India, targeting was introduced so that only some households with a certain income criterion was set. Only households falling below that income would be able to access the food rations. And there has been, luckily for us, detailed consumer expenditure surveys in Sri Lanka as there are in India, and based on that, Ravi Kanbur and Sudhir Anand showed how the per capita subsidy fell by about 1/3 in 3 years, between 1979 and 1982, after the IMF policies had been implemented. And I think the important point is not that the value of the subsidy went down, because in fact that is the objective of the policy, to reduce the size of the subsidy. So in all countries where such policies were brought in, immediate effect was felt on government budgets, because value of food subsidy went down. But I think the more worrying point, or the critical point, is that what did it mean in terms of nutrition or in food intake of people we are concerned about? And again, what the Sri Lanka example shows, that food prices started jumping, and if you actually look at malnutrition, again, there were two surveys, one done in the early 70s, or sorry, 75, 76, mid-70s, before this IMF program came in, and one done in the early 80s. And in between these two, there was an increase in the proportion of children suffering from acute malnutrition. So I think the point is that in countries like Sri Lanka and India, this kind of very narrow targeting is just not going to work, and we're actually going to end up excluding a lot of people and increasing therefore excluding the vulnerable, and therefore maybe even increasing malnutrition or increasing food insecurity. You had a similar situation in Jamaica, and here too Jamaica is, as I said, was very well known as a country that was somehow managing to have, they had a universal healthcare system, they had food subsidies, reasonably good universal schooling system in place. And in the late 70s, there were 10 IMF agreements and 3 World Bank structural programs. And as a consequence of all these, the cut in food subsidies and cut in expenditure on social sector was very clear. And again, in the case of Jamaica, what you had was, they had the system not like of rations, but of generalized price subsidies. That means that the price of wheat is lower than the market price. So it's you buy it in the market, not through special ration shops. But it was decided to do away with these price subsidies and go to targeted food stamps or food coupons, which would again be restricted to those considered below the poverty line or some income criteria. Now again, the way these things work, as is very similar as we'll see when we come to India, the poverty line that was taken for the cutoff was lower than even what the official Ministry of Statistics was giving as the poverty line, because the objective was to reduce food subsidy as much as possible. And again, you see what is the impact of doing away with food subsidies and narrow targeting was the huge increase in the general price index, the food price index, because as I said, the subsidy used to be in for all households. And as a result of this, after a few years, there was a calculation, so these programs started in the late 70s. In the early to mid 80s, there is a calculation has been done that the price of a minimum food basket, comprising a set of commodities that you'd consider for a minimum household consumption, would cost $120 a week for a family, Jamaican $120 at that time, and the minimum wage at that time was $40 a week. So even if there were 2 working members, 2 adults, you would not be able to buy the minimum commodity bundle required for a family to survive. So we see that in other countries as well. In Tunisia, you have so many examples. In Zambia, in Mexico, you've had structure adjustment programs with very clear objective of reducing food subsidy. And in countries where there are large number of people who are still food insecure, high levels of malnutrition, and where you do not have, as I told you in the case of Jamaica or India or Sri Lanka, when inflation goes up, most people's salaries and wages do not go up automatically, so you don't have indexing. In these cases, you find that increased price inflation after the reduction of food subsidies has really led to severe cutbacks, increases in malnutrition, and worsening food insecurity.